Are we not too early to conclude that vaping is a good option? And I'll tell you why I asked this question.
Yeah.
Because the history of cigarettes has in it a time when even doctors would prescribe it.
Yeah. Is it easier to stop smoking if you've gone into vaping? Yes. Does it mean that you will completely cease using anything? No. It was easier to stop vaping than it was to stop smoking. So I had to go from smoking to vaping to complete cessation, right? It was an intermittent thing, right? But eventually I stopped both. They say to me, using heroin feels like being held in the arms of your mother.
Wow.
We tend to be quite moralistic when we deal with substance use, and we tend to think that the right way is to stop. And that comes often from very religious speak, that if you believe in God, if you have faith, if you do all of this, it's the 12-step program with Narcotics Anonymous and so on and so forth, Alcoholics Anonymous, then the option is either you use or you don't use. It's a binary.
King David Studio Podcast.
As always, we do our best to bring you people who know more about subjects that personally I'm curious about. And one in particular is vaping. I've seen an increase in the number of people use it, from young to old. And it's something that I've always wondered about, if it comes with possible dangers at all. And today we managed to get hold of Professor Monique Marks in the studio to really help us understand. How you doing?
I'm good, thanks. Good to be here.
Thank you so much for making time. I hear you traveled all the way from some foreign country.
Well, almost, because I'm actually going to be visiting Australia on Sunday. But I'm from Durban currently, but originally from Johannesburg.
Oh, really? So this is home?
It is home. It was home, yes.
What led to the move to Durban?
I was actually offered a position at what was then the University of Natal. And so I moved to the University of Tel, having worked at the ANC head office prior to that.
Wow.
And I think moving to Durban was a lifesaver, actually. My life was pretty crazy here. Yeah. So I've been there ever since, which was a long time ago.
Interesting. I studied in Durban.
Oh, did you?
Yeah. My junior degree is a Durban junior degree.
At where?
At University of Durban, Westville.
Oh.
Back then, it became University of KZN now.
That's correct.
Yes, that's where I'm from.
Wow.
I studied administration and economics and industrial psychology. Yeah, I was undecided, but I was more interested in economics at the time.
Okay.
Yeah, I've lost interest over the years.
There were some amazing people, though, in that economics department.
Yes.
Vishnu Padiachi.
Wow, amazing.
Yes,
you remember people like that.
I do.
Yes.
Yeah.
I'm glad you're here. What has led you to this new world of vaping, and I'll call it that, or health, and describe really your role in today's conversation? Okay,
so maybe just to say, to begin at the very beginning, and that is how I got involved in the space of harm reduction.
Yes.
That happened about 12 years ago. When I was first introduced to heroin use, which became a big issue in Durban, obviously a big issue across the country, with a number of different names, in this province, in Gauteng, usually in the form of Nayope. In Durban, we would refer to it as Unga Wunga. Ultimately, it's all heroin. And my very first entry into harm reduction was trying to make sense of how do we create spaces and programs that allow people who are dealing with a opioid use disorder to normalize their lives. In other words, to make their lives better.
Okay.
And what I quickly understood is this thing of saying don't do it or stop was ineffective. In other words, abstinence was ineffective, and so was all the punitive responses. Stigmatizing, criminalizing, putting people into prison, tough love was actually all making the problem worse and not better. And so I turned towards a very different approach of understanding substance use, and in that case it was opioid use, heroin use, but it applies to all. And that was really to say, let's understand people where they're at. Let's meet them where they're at. Let's accept that they have rights that they are human beings that have made choices for a number of different reasons. Try to understand why those choices have been made, and try to find ways of making substance use less harmful while allowing people to develop their own self-determined goals. Because when we determine goals for other people, they don't adhere. You know, if I was to say to you, please, if you smoke 5 beers a week, let's say, stop tomorrow because I want you to. You're either going to start doing it in secret or you're going to rebel completely and drink more. Those will be your two options. The chances of you saying, sure, that's fine, and walking away.
And stopping the following morning.
Highly unlikely, right? Now, in the space of opioid use, you know, it's even more difficult to just stop. That's because of both the psychological and the physical addiction. It's a word I don't like, but I'll use it now. And so it becomes very important in that space, if you're a harm reduction person, to say, what can I substitute what you're using with that will give you a similar feeling, but will be less harmful to your body and allow you to normalize your life, right? So in the case of, for example, heroin use or opiate use, we would look at opiate substitutes, which are medications, which give you a similar feel, but they are a lot less harmful for a number of reasons. They're regulated. You can do what we call down titrate. In other words, get people to use less if they want to, or more if they want to, but in a safe and regulated way, right? And
how successful is that?
So if you look at abstinence with heroin, for example, and you send people into if you call it a rehab, where there's abstinence, the success rate of abstinence is about 7%. If we look at success differently, and we say success is about normalizing your life and improving the quality of your life, which means reconnecting with significant others, taking care of your personal hygiene and your general health, you know, doing the things that are meaningful to you, working, education, whatever it is that makes your life qualitatively better, then we're talking leaps and bounds. We're talking up to about 75%.
Wow.
Right? So it's incomparable. It's totally incomparable. So, you know, we're very quick to judge people. For example, if you've been, let's say, injecting opiates 15 times a day and you move to twice a day, people say that's not good enough. But to me, that's success. That's massive success, right? If you're able to inject yourself twice a day with heroin and you're still able to look after your kids, connect with your family, go to work, get to the gym, take care of your personal hygiene, take your ARVs if you haven't been, that to me is a massive, massive turnaround, and it's a huge success, right? So we tend to be quite moralistic when we deal with substance use, and we tend to think that the right way is to stop. And that comes often from very religious speak, you know, that if you believe in God, if you have faith, if you do all of this, it's the 12-step program with, you know, with Narcotics Anonymous and so on and so forth, Alcoholics Anonymous, then the option is either you use or you don't use. It's a binary, right? But it's not a binary. It's a continuum. And I'm going to say this as well, right? We are all substance users in some form or the other.
Example?
We are either caffeine users, right, which is a substance. And what does caffeine do? It raises our cortisol levels. Once our cortisol levels are very high, we go into a flight and fight situation. Is that always a problem? No, it's not. But it is a problem, for example, if you have hormonal issues or if you have hypertension or if you have diabetes, because all of our hormones are knocking off each other, right? So your cortisol goes up, it affects your insulin levels as well, right? And so we find that a lot of people in South Africa, for example, are now struggling with diabetes. We have a very high diabetes rate, right?
That's true.
And part of it is because our cortisol levels are always high because we're always in a state of anxiety, either because of the caffeine that we're ingesting or because of the state of our, you know, the levels of anxiety of our country.
Look at me.
Look at you having a cup of coffee, right? Let me not judge, because that's your self-determined choice, right?
Yes.
But the other one, which is even more problematic and we don't speak about, is sugar. Sugar is the most inflammatory substance that we can put into our body. It is the source of almost every single illness that we know, including cancer. And yet we have it unproblematically, and we give it to our children as a treat. And we teach them that it's okay, and it's really not. And we don't
have warning signs against it.
No warning signs. And there's a third one, and that is alcohol. Alcohol is legal in South Africa. There are countries that it's not legal, but it is extremely harmful. If you were, for example, to compare cannabis with alcohol, and you were to say to me, which would you prefer? I would say cannabis. And there's a good reason, right? Firstly, nobody has ever died of a cannabis overdose. And secondly, people, when they use cannabis, generally don't become aggressive. We know
they get mellow.
They get mellow, mostly. Okay, you can
Mostly.
trip and you can become quite anxious.
Okay.
But you don't find that people will smoke a joint or have a cannabis vape or have a gummy and start beating up their wife, right? However, we do see that with alcohol. We see that the level of aggressions are very high, and we also see the correlation between drinking and accidents on the road. So there are many correlations with legal substances, right? And substances that we see as highly acceptable in our daily lives.
True.
Caffeine, sugar, alcohol. And we don't stigmatize people. In fact, we encourage it. We think if you get drunk, there's something amusing about it,
I don't drink. I haven't for 99% of my life.
Yep.
Only drank only once.
Yep.
And very often I've been told, what's wrong with you?
Totally right.
Yeah.
Totally
so
right.
clearly our socialization is a problem in that
Yep.
regard as well.
Well, let's not make it a problem, right? Because then we get into this binary again, right? But let's rather say, why are we judging some people for using some substances and not judging other people for using alcohol, for example? Let's equalize the playing field, right? And the minute we start putting things outside of the sort of light, if you want to call it, we start playing soccer in the dark,
Got
right?
you. Yeah.
When you play soccer in the dark, in other words, when you try to ban something or try to make it illicit or try to get somebody to hide it, you can't see the goalpost anymore. You can't watch the ball, right? It's not possible. You don't know who your team is.
Yes.
And so the game here is to say, how do we play soccer in the light? With whatever we're doing, with whatever substance it is. Bring it into the light, let people talk about it, let people own it, engage in it, have open debates, don't judge.
Today we're bringing vaping
Yeah.
to the light.
Yeah.
And something that comes across very clearly in the notes that I've read speak of harm reduction.
Yeah.
Is vaping a tool for harm reduction in relation to smoking?
Okay, this is uncontroversial, actually, now. There are many, more than 750 studies that talk to how vaping, in fact, all what we call non-combusting tobacco products, if we want to call them that. In other words, anything that is a substitute for a cigarette or is similar to a cigarette but is not a cigarette, right, is definitely, without a doubt, less harmful. So if you're smoking a cigarette, let me tell you where the harms come in there, right? The harm is firstly in the burning of the cigarette. That is the carcinogenic part of smoking, right? But in the actual tobacco, there are a number of chemicals, and there's tar, which is extremely toxic to our bodies, right? Let's compare with a vape, right?
Let's stick to cigarette for
Okay,
1 second. One
sure,
second.
sure.
The actual tobacco that's planted and then gets converted into tobacco on its own.
Yeah.
Is it as harmful? And I say on its own because my research tells me there's more chemicals that are put into the
Sure.
cigarette more than just the tobacco.
Totally right. So you'll find that what was happening at one point in Europe is that people were moving from buying cigarettes, the commercial cigarettes, to rolling their own cigarettes, right? Because of the less chemicals in it, right?
Uh-huh.
But I think that was prior to people understanding the problem of combusting. And that doesn't take away the combusting. So it takes away some of the chemicals, but it doesn't take away the combusting, right? And that's when places like Sweden introduced what was called snus, right? Which is it was a pouch almost with tobacco in it, which people would put under their tongue or under their in their mouth by the side of their gum, which was releasing tobacco. Right? And that was a form of harm reduction too, because you weren't combusting anymore. So snus is still very popular in places like Sweden. And because of snus, Sweden has become an almost smoke-free society.
Wow.
Right? Which is really important.
Because you're getting the same sensation, is that what you're saying?
Well, you're getting the same. Well, we need to get onto the sensation. But in terms of getting the release of tobacco, yes. And then there's the modality, right? So for some people, that's enough because what they're addicted to or what they're dependent on is the tobacco, right? For other people, that's not enough, right? Because they like the modality of smoking,
the
right?
whole experience.
The whole experience. Because with it comes, a sociability, it's a sharing, it's a doing something with your hand, which you're not going to get with the snooze, right?
Yeah. Taking time off work to go to the smoke break.
Exactly, to meet other people who are doing the same thing, right? The smokers are very sociable people, generally, right? So, so we need to talk about modalities as well. Yeah. So if I go back to the heroin space, for example, and this, I learned this very early on in my engagement in opioid use disorders, it was during the AIDS conference, which I think was in 2017, and we had a harm reduction stand there. And there were people coming from all over the world, and they were wanting to know, how do we get hold of good quality illicit drugs, and so what we had to do is find people who were living on the streets or were in the drug space and saying, look, this is where you can get decent stuff that's not going to be toxic, right? I know this sounds radical, but it is, right? It does. And I remember one of the women who came from Melbourne was explaining to me how it wasn't just the heroin, it was the actual ritual of injecting that she loved, And
but not everyone would react the same.
No,
obviously.
But I think there's a lesson in that, right? Which I didn't understand as someone who's never injected opiates in my life before, right? Was to say there are two things going on here. There's the modality and there's the substance. And I'm raising this because of the vape, right? Because you can say to somebody who's a smoker, use, for example, a nicotine pouch, right? Which will give you the nicotine release, and we'll deal with that, but it's not the modality. And that's why I'm raising it.
Use a gum.
You can use a gum as well. Yeah. Although the historical nicotine replacements, like the gum, are much, much less effective than the ones that are currently available, right? The Nicorettes and all of those have not been proven to be very effective at all. So we need to look at what's new on the market, right? So for people who miss that being able to pull, right? And you can call it an oral fixation, you can call it agitation. A lot of people have, various mental health issues, right? For example, high levels of anxiety, or people that need to be doing something with their hands. If you've got extreme levels of ADHD, you will go for both a stimulant and for doing something with your hands. Now, simply having a nicotine pouch in those cases won't work. So let me give you an example of how I would use it in a medical setting, right? Because I'm often called into hospitals for a variety of reasons, the psychosocial part of my work. And I had a very interesting experience. This was a couple of, when I first started private practice, went full-time into private practice, I was called into a hospital to assist with somebody who was going in for an operation. But they couldn't operate on this man because he was a smoker, right? And it is very dangerous to operate on heavy smokers, right? So they have to abstain for a period of time. And this guy was saying to me, I'm going to go insane. There's no ways I can just stop now. And I had to think about this very carefully. And I said to him, if I give you a nicotine pouch and at the same time, a nicotine-free vape, which are they're not as available as the nicotine vapes, right? Will that help? It worked like a charm. Wow. And the doctors were amazed, because he wasn't inhaling the smoke. It was far less dangerous, right? But I had to do both simultaneously.
Gotcha.
There are other people that, for example, say, no, it's just the nicotine. And you can get away with either the vape or with something like the snooze, right? Yeah. For example. So you have to look at each individual and say, what is it that they're getting out of this? What is it giving them? Is it giving them just the nicotine kick, or is it the modality, or is it a combination of both? And then you need to say, okay, what's the solution here? So I think the importance of vapes is that they provide an alternative to smoking if we know that smoking is harmful, because, it's both the combusting and it's what goes into the chemicals of the industrial produced cigarettes, right? But there are other nicotine products available. But we're sticking with the vape today, right?
I want us to stick with the vape because the popularity of the vape is gone ridiculous,
Yeah.
and amongst young people, you walk into just about any retail place, there's a counter that has them, and that's probably why I'm more interested in it than others. But I want us to simplify the combustion in this context of cigarette. What is that? It's the burning.
It's the burning of both. It could just be the burning of the paper. It could be the burning of the paper and the nicotine or the tobacco in this case.
That moment. That's where the
combusting is the carcinogenic point, right? So even now, even with joints, with marijuana, even with that, I would even say if you're going to have cannabis, you even using a little bit of the combusting there as well, which is carcinogenic, right? So rather get yourself a cannabis vape or get yourself a cannabis gummy or get yourself an oil or something else, right? Because you're reducing that. Exactly, right? Yeah. But again, that prefers on what people's preferences are.
True.
What is it that if they like that pull again of the joint, right? Then you rather get yourself a cannabis vape. You're not going to say have a gummy if you like the pull, right? If you know what I'm saying. So yes, it's true that you get vapes everywhere now, right? And we'll talk about the regulation of vapes in a minute. But think about this. You can also get cigarettes in every single cafe that you walk into, right?
Yeah.
So
probably same place you get the vape. Like lately, you get cigarettes.
So. Yeah. So the tobacco shops now will sell the vapes and they'll sell the tobacco. A couple of cafes will sell the vapes, but most of them only still sell cigarettes, right? And South Africa is unusually one of the few countries in the world where cigarette smoking is on the rise, not on the decrease.
Wow.
Which is a scary thing.
Do we know why?
I think if you were to ask me, any substance that's on the increase will happen in a society that's highly traumatized, because people are always looking for ways in which we can relieve stress and get a come down, right? So it's no surprise that all substance use is on the increase in South Africa. That includes illicit drugs, and, tobacco, alcohol, all the whole round.
Including sugar,
yes. Yeah. Because people are comfort eating, right? And when you comfort eat, you're not going to have, a carrot or a green bean. Well, I would, but other people won't, right? So, so there is this thing about processed foods and around sugar being comforting because of the way that we brought up. You got a problem, don't worry, we'll take you for an ice cream, Okay? Or we'll go to McDonald's because that's a treat, right? But what we're doing is we're destroying our children's health right from the time that they are babies. Yeah. And then by the time they're 40, we're dealing with diabetes, hypertension, cardiovascular, and we're en route to cancer. So as parents, and I talk about parents not necessarily biologically, but as older people in the society, people that could be parents, we need to be saying, hey, what you're putting into that kid's mouth and what's going to be the long-term outcome of that, right? So it's not just vaping. We don't, because we think illness only starts late in life, but it doesn't. It starts right from when we're 2 to 3 years old. So, we're debating vapes, but I'm really glad that we're getting into other substances.
Yeah, because they matter just as much.
They really do.
I want us to, we spoke about what happens when a cigarette is, what led to its pulled.
Yeah.
What happens with a vape? My experience, a very innocent experience of watching someone vape.
Yeah.
I see them pull. Yeah. And then the smoke that comes out.
Yeah.
I'm concluding that there's a burn that happens for that smoke to happen. But
yes.
Clearly, maybe I'm wrong in the way I interpret the process.
It's not really a burn. It's they products which we call heat not burn.
Okay.
So they're heating, but they're not burning. Right, so you're actually not burning the substance, you're heating it up. And that heating creates a vaporization. So when you see that exhale, it's actually vapor. It's not a substance, right?
Which is why it's called vape.
That's why it's called vape, right? Yeah. And this is a very important point because what is released from the vape, you're not going to get that sort of secondary effect that you get from smoking, which is why, the people that are now most supportive of vapes are those people in the public health space, because you're not impacting on the public health of other people by vaping. The question then is, are vapes dangerous or are they not?
It's the most obvious. And I'll tell you, in preparation for this, I came across videos that will tell you immediately that it's worse than cigarettes. Let's explain that. Help
Okay.
us understand if indeed there are dangers with vaping at all.
Okay. So, when you compare vapes to cigarettes, right, it's incomparable because of the combusting, because of the millions of chemicals that are in cigarettes, right? And so anybody that thinks that cigarettes are not harmful, I mean, people will say to you, my father lived till 95 and he didn't have anything wrong with him, right? Therefore, cigarettes are not a problem.
And he
right?
smokes a pack a day.
Yes.
Yes.
That's N equals maybe 1 or 2 out of N equals like hundreds of thousands who do land up with cardiovascular risk, if not, some pulmonary disease, if not cancer, if not something else, right? So we need to be very clear about that. There is no such thing as harmless cigarette smoking. That does not exist, right? Let's switch to vaping. Are there harms associated with vaping? There are harms associated with nicotine, right? And vaping is got nicotine in it, right? Okay. So nicotine can raise your heart rate. It can raise your blood pressure. Okay. And there are a few chemicals in the vapes, right? Especially when they are flavored. They're flavorant chemicals, right? So, if you've got, like, say, for example, like a hypertension problem, it may create a little bit of a problem. Or if you've got a heart problem, it may create a little bit of a increased heart rate, right? Sure. But in comparison, it's almost negligible, right? That's not to say they're not harmful, right?
What about long-term use?
Long-term use has not, again, I'm going to say this, right? Would I recommend that somebody, for example, with asthma smokes a vape? I would say be careful, right? See how it affects you. See if it does anything to you that makes you feel like, okay, I'm not breathing as well as I could, right? And everybody's different. It's the same with food. Some people say don't have wheat, but for a lot of people, it doesn't have any impact at all, right? And if people are smoking cigarettes with asthma, that's a no-go. I mean, that's an absolute no-go. But with the vaping, they will need to be able to say, okay, this is how I'm feeling. If it's affecting you negatively, then that respiratory impact is a negative thing, right? And then you've got to deal with it, and you've got to say, how do we get you down to a minimal use of vaping, right? Because we're not going to always say, just stop, because we know that that's not effective. Yeah. But in comparison, the evidence weighted towards vaping now is move towards vaping for 2 reasons. One is because it's far less harmful in terms of both chemicals and in terms of the combusting, but also because there's now a ton of evidence that vaping is a route to stopping smoking, right? To smoking cessation. And we haven't had much of that in the past, right? And we really need to get away from smoking cigarettes because that is a real problem. Now, there are many questions about that because,
let me tell you one that crosses my mind.
Yes.
I see it the other way around.
Right.
That vaping could be the beginning of smoking for a young person who is just being introduced to vaping for the first time. And now it almost looks like, from an innocent perspective, a natural transition to a graduation to a higher level, which is now I'm using cigarettes. What do you say to that?
So there's a lot of myths around gateway substances, right? So, for example, a lot of hype around cannabis because everyone said, oh, cannabis is a gateway drug. You start with cannabis, you end up using other drugs, right? It's not true. Right? It's simply not true. We've seen now that there's been, a decriminalization of cannabis. It has not led to an increase of drug use amongst people that are cannabis users. Most people that use cannabis users are not interested in other drugs, right? Yeah. They only smoke cannabis, right? You'll know this from your own friends. They're not going to look at somebody shooting up heroin and say, hey, that looks cool, I'm going to become a heroin user, right? Yes. They're not going to do that, right? Yeah. There are people that are curious about psychoactive drugs and they will experiment, but that's not because they're using cannabis. It's because they're exploring in their minds or because they have a mental health issue or because, they're just fascinated by drugs or because they're using substances, and I'm talking about all substances because there's underlying trauma and disconnect, right? So there are many reasons for that. Now, young people, this is important in the debate, right? It's very important because where most people get very anxious is when, for example, people in their teen years have started vaping across the world, right? And we can't say, because I've already said to you quite honestly, they are not harmless. They are just a whole lot less harmful, right? Okay. Yeah. But have a chat to any young person and say to them, if you weren't using a vape, what would you be using? And I would tell you.
An innocent child would say nothing.
How many children are innocent?
That's the thing.
Right?
They will hide it somewhere. They
may
something.
hide it, but I, as a therapist, right, I deal with a lot of young people in my sessions. Many of them are vaping. And I ask them this question because of my interest in tobacco harm reduction. And I say to them, if you weren't vaping, what were you doing? And they all say to me, we'd have cigarettes, right? Because it is the stage at which young people start experimenting with substances, right? Whatever they may be, right? And also it's a time when people want to look cool, right? So there was a time when I was young when smoking was a cool thing to do, right? Didn't matter what the consequences were, like it was a thing on campus, like everybody smoked, right? In fact, I remember sitting in meeting rooms where we would all be smoking in the meeting room, right? Now you can't do that, but then you could. Wits University, like we used to sit in our, activist meetings and everybody was smoking. It was a sign of who you were, right? Yeah. Now it's not that, and I think young people will be looking for things. You'll find that, young people are starting, parents are very anxious. Oh, my child started drinking. They took a drink when they were 14. Is that a terrible thing? No, it's not a terrible thing. But get your child to talk about it. Let them speak about, how did the alcohol feel? Most people say it made them feel terrible. It didn't make them feel great, right? But they wanted to try it because they're seeing it happening, right? And you can pretend that young kids are not trying, but they are. They're experimenting with a range of different things, from sex to vaping, to alcohol, to a range of different things, right? And these are the things we don't speak about. And this is why, for example, not speaking about sex is not taking us anywhere except getting us into a whole lot of teenage pregnancies, right? Because we want to pretend that it's not happening, but it is, right? Because that's what people do. They explore with their bodies, they explore with their minds. And that's what being young is all about, right? So, this is where I think we need to get into the regulatory space and say, when is it okay for people to start using vapes and when is it not okay? Will we be able to regulate completely? No, because homes are a private space, right? So you can say to people that sex is legal after the age of 16, but in a private house, if you as a parent say, I'm okay with my kid having sex at 13, well, that's your choice as a parent, right?
Can't control that.
Can't control it, right? Yeah. And so, these are the difficult conversations that we do need to have, and we need to be having them with kids and saying, like, is the vape there because it's cool? Or is it there because you're fidgeting and you've got ADHD and you're not managing? Is there a depressive component to it? I've sat recently in a conference that took place in the US around vaping, and it was mostly medical people who were in the room, and I wasn't expecting people from top universities like Oxford, Yale, Cambridge, all of those to be participating in this vaping conversation.
Why such great interest?
Because I think they now recognize, and there's a lot of support now for saying we've got to give up the anti-vape thing. Because there are more benefits to promoting vapes as a harm reduction tool than kicking it out of the ballpark completely. But what was interesting is, you always have to look at people with lived experience, right? People who are actually doing what they're doing, right? So if you want to understand heroin use, for example, I can't tell you what it feels like to be a heroin user.
Of course.
But when I speak to people who use heroin, and they're living on the streets and they've had damn traumatic lives, and they say to me, and this is true, they say to me, using heroin feels like being held in the arms of your mother.
Wow.
Now you tell me, if you're living on the street, can you take that away from that person without giving them anything back?
Of course not.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. So when I was listening to this US conference, which was a massive coming together of medical practitioners and medical experts, there was a young woman who came onto the panel, and she was a vapor. And she said she's got bipolar disorder and she's got ADHD. And she said, if you take away my vape, you've taken away my cigarette, but if you take away my vape, I will go completely insane because I won't have anything to do with my hands. I won't have anything to do when I'm fidgeting. I'll feel more awkward in social environments. That vape is what's keeping me sane, right? So we've got to look at the end user. We've got to look at the person with the lived experience and say, what does it mean to you? What does it give you as an individual? Not blanket, this is terrible, this is bad, right? And that's where people's stories become really important, right? And if you are concerned about your young person, your teenager, for example, using a vape, you've got to say, my child, what is the vape bringing you? Is it that you're feeling awkward in a social environment without it? And then what is that awkwardness? Or is it that it looks cool and you want to be cool? And then we have to say, okay, if you're using it, how much do you need to use to be cool, right? Or is it because they do have an issue with ADHD and it's a form of fidgeting, But what is the reason? And I always say, in the space of drug use, drugs are not the problem. They are a solution to an already existing problem.
Okay.
Find out what the problem is, right? Usually with substance use, there's an underlying problem. And drugs or substances are a solution to that problem. If you don't find out the problem, you're never going to deal with the solution, right?
Are we not too early to conclude that vaping is a good option? And I'll tell you why I asked this question.
Yeah.
Because the history of cigarettes has in it a time when even doctors would prescribe it as a solution to some ailments.
Yeah.
So that means there was a time in the medical history of cigarettes where cigarettes were recommended by doctors.
Yeah.
So clearly there was a time in the story where we thought cigarettes are good.
Yes.
And are we not at that stage with vaping where we haven't had enough time to really, truly evaluate whether they're good or not? And I hear harm reduction, 100%. But are we not too early to make a judgment that vaping may be a better option?
So you're quite right. Science is a moving thing, right? Science changes all the time, right? I mean, again, if we look at other things like we look at food, right? There was a time when people believed margarine was a great alternative to butter, right? And we all grew up in the society where we were told, use margarine, not butter, right? Have cereal, it's great for you in the morning, right? Now we all know those were the two biggest advertising successes ever, right?
100%.
Right? And everybody now that was eating cereals all the time are now struggling with diabetes, hypertension, and obesity, right? And now getting kids off cereal in the morning is a big problem, right? Because of the high levels of sugar in it, right? Margarine too. People are like, but the Heart Foundation supports margarine, right? The Heart Foundation is a major problem in this war around heart disease, right? Because margarine is a totally chemical food, if you want to call it, or food-like substance, which is what I call it, right? So you are quite correct. We do need to be collecting evidence ongoing, right? Ongoing. But I would say that we've got a good 10 or so years now into the evidence. It's not like this is like 1 year or 2 years, right? And the evidence is increasingly moving towards saying vaping, firstly, is incredibly successful in moving towards no smoking in terms of smoking cessation. And we know the harms associated with smoking. Now we know this clearly, right? Do we know 100% where the harms with vaping will go to long term? No, we don't, right? But what we do know for sure is it is far less harmful. That we can say absolutely with a given, right? There are people, just like we had with for example, the vaccine, right? People are anti the COVID-19 vaccine, right? And yes, it's true that some people have got ill from the COVID-19 vaccine, but the majority of us did not, right? The majority of us are fine. We're walking around and we know that it created an immunity. We know this for a fact, right? But there will be people that will have had negative outcomes of it. And that's the same with vaping, right? And let me say, it's the same with a whole lot of things. People are also going crazy using Botox at the moment, right?
Our bodies don't react the same.
They don't react the same. But people are saying Botox is not going to have a negative effect. How on earth do we know that? In 20 years' time, we may find that it is, right? So you're quite right. We are quite relatively new in the game to be absolute. But there is enough evidence, right? And there's enough studies to know that it is far less harmful. And that's why I'm saying again and again and again, I am not here saying that vapes are not harmful at all. I'm saying that they do have some effects that, may not be great, particularly for people that are already struggling with things like hypertension and with heart issues and underlying issues, But they certainly are going to be less harmful than cigarettes, even with those conditions, right? Because remember, they have nicotine in as well, cigarettes. They have nicotine and tobacco, right? So we've got to be really careful about what we're saying. And I'm going to go back to the combusting, because the combusting is something which we know absolutely that is carcinogenic and that vaping is non-carcinogenic. Now, why is this a problem? Because out of all the illnesses that exist, right, Cancer is something that we still do not have control over.
That's
right?
true.
It is growing. It is not getting less, right? And cancer is a scary illness, right? Because it never disappears. If you were to say to me, and it's the same with, there are a range of other illnesses as well. Diabetes is on the rise as well, right? So we need to say, what are the illnesses that are on the rise and that are not going down, right? And how do we try and get into a more preventative space, right? Mm-hmm. So knowing that something is not carcinogenic is in itself an important fact, right? That we have to hold on to and say, we know this for a fact. We've got to hold on to it because we know that if you are moving towards vaping, you're not in the carcinogenic space, right? You may be getting other chemicals going in, much less, right? About, I would say, 80% less than are in cigarettes, right? That's not saying there are no chemicals, right? There are, but far, 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 far less, right? And we know that there's no carcinogenic effect.
Let's pause for a second and,
Sure.
and indulge my imagination.
Yeah,
A world that has no cigarettes.
yeah,
I want you to spend a second
Sure.
just to picture it.
yeah,
A world where cigarettes are completely non-existent, whether they are banned or they never made it.
Yeah.
They never existed.
Yeah.
We never discovered
Yeah.
tobacco,
yeah,
but we discovered vaping.
yeah.
Would vaping be the bad guy in the story?
So yes, it would, in a way. I think this is where the issue around young people comes in, because do we want people putting substances into their body for no reason? No. And so, there is a caution around young people and vaping, and this is where the whole issue becomes very, very, it becomes almost like a crisis. Mm-hmm. And so you get countries like Australia where they're trying to, get rid of anything that looks like a cigarette, including the vape, right?
Okay.
And the reason for that is, we don't want people putting substances into their bodies through inhaling, whatever the modality may be. I don't think Australia is going to win this war, I'll be honest with you, because their neighbour, New Zealand, which was anti-vaping for a long time, have now done a complete turnaround.
Okay.
And they are now saying, we accept that vaping is a far better alternative to smoking, and we're not going to get all hyped about it. But they are regulating highly in the sector of young people under the age of 18, right? So it's where the regulatory space comes in. So the answer to your question is it's complicated, right? Because people have used substances across time and in every part of the world,
True.
right?
Of all forms.
Whether
From
they're
mushrooms
opiates,
to...
Totally.
Yes.
Totally, right? So is there a part of the world and a period of time where substances have not been used? The answer to that is no, right? Absolutely not. And we know if we go to the Eastern Cape, people will tell you we've been using cannabis for centuries, right? And we are fine. We have not become problematic. We have not moved on to heroin. That is the last thing, You speak to an elderly person who's been using cannabis in, Mthatha, for example, and ask them, have you ever thought about using rock? They'll look at you as if you've gone out of your total mind, right? It's a ritual. It's something which is not harmful. It's something which has been part of, a community sort of way of bonding. And if it's used in that way as a ritualistic thing, it's not a problem, right? But then what do? We have the war on drugs. And what does the war on drugs do? It puts everything under the carpet, and it means that people are then using in ways that are problematic, and it's unregulated, and it's not safe, and it becomes a huge problem, right? So sometimes the law is more harmful than the substance itself, right? And I want to put that out there. Because are we ever going to have a substance-free society? And the answer to that is no. Because
we saw this during COVID.
We really did.
When
right?
alcohol was not available, but it became available.
Totally did.
Yes.
People started making their own alcohol, right? But most people who had access to it were buying alcohol in the black market. And let me tell you a little secret here about myself, right? Because I was a smoker during COVID. Okay, I've never smoked a lot, but I was smoking maybe 2 cigarettes a day.
Yeah.
And it was my come down. That's what the purpose of cigarettes were. I don't smoke anymore, right? But, let me tell you, I knew every place where I could get illicit cigarettes from.
Wow.
And I'll tell you what, the cops were watching because they were using those places too, right? So, I've worked with law enforcement my whole life. So I know how these things operate, right? Cigarettes were available, but the problem was we were getting cigarettes that were less regulated than the ones that we had. So I do not have a clue what the cigarettes I was smoking had in them. I knew that I felt worse when I smoked them than I did when I smoked my usual cigarettes, which didn't make me feel good either, but these made me feel worse, right? So we have this real problem of saying, let's get rid of something completely because another substance will pop up in another form, in another modality, right? And we have to be realistic about this, right? Because people are by nature curious, we are experimenters, and we do want to get into altered states, right? This is why people use alcohol a lot, right? It's not because they want to be problematic. It's because it's a way of either being able to socialize without inhibition, or it's a way of forgetting your troubles, or it's become something so socially acceptable that it's a way of making friends, right? If you say to somebody, stop drinking, just stop, they're not going to do it, right? They're not going to do it until there's a crisis, right?
In their lives, in their body.
In their bodies, right? Or not only in their bodies. It could be something like this. It could be, I drank a lot, I didn't realize how much I drank, and I got into a serious accident and someone died. That may be the crisis that needed to happen. But here's the other thing. It may be what gets you into even worse drinking, because you just cannot deal with that reality, right? So we never quite know where the human mind and where trauma is going to take us. But what we do know is we need to be kind to human beings, to understand what is the driver of your substance use, whatever it is, and let's try and deal with that underlying driver, right? And what we also need to be saying is let's move into the less harmful space in whatever it is, right? There was a time when people thought, why do we need seatbelts? Seatbelts are just a hassle.
There's
right?
still a community of people that don't understand it.
Right?
Yes.
But seatbelts are a form of harm reduction, right? They are the original harm reduction. Driving can be very unsafe, but it's less unsafe if you wear a seatbelt, right?
Yeah.
If you crash, you're less likely to go through the windscreen if you were wearing a seatbelt than if you're not, right? And now we accept that. We may not accept it with the back seat, right? But we certainly accept it with the front seat because we don't want our partner or our child going through the windscreen, right? We haven't got yet to the point where we realize that the back seat also is important.
Of course.
But in other countries, it's a no-negotiable, right? If you go into the global north and you don't have seatbelts, you can get a fine for that, right? Because equally, you can catapult from the back, right, through the windscreen, right?
I have a friend who passed away from not having a seatbelt at the back.
Precisely, right? Yeah. So we've got to start talking about how do we stop the harm? How do we stop the harm?
I'm curious, though, about a parent who is listening to this conversation.
Yeah.
And this conversation sounds like it's okay for your child to vape. That's the takeout. And obviously I can explain more, but that's what they're hearing. And they're saying, but there's too much advertising directed at my child in relation to this.
Yeah.
It's looking cool every time I see it. Yeah. It's colorful, it's fruity, it's tasty, it's all of that. Yeah. And I'm worried about my child. Yeah. What do you say to that parent, and what do you say equally to that child? Because we can't be encouraging the child to be using it.
No, we can't. But the thing is, it's the same with any form of substance, right? We want to prevent it before it starts, right? And that's the gold standard, right? So before anyone gets into that, we stop it, right? Yeah. We don't want people to start smoking. We don't want people to have unsafe sex, right? We don't want people to start drinking too young. We don't want all of those things. And we should be saying we don't want our kids to become sugar addicts, right? Because that ultimately is going to have long-term chronic illness problems, right? So let's prevent it in the first place. And our medicine and health is not really good at prevention. We're much better at dealing with the treatment.
There's a lot more money made on the other side.
Not just that, but I think medical training is not so good in the preventative space, right? So as parents, I think we've got to say, what's going on in our kids' lives that's driving them to feel, okay, I'm so insecure that I need to be doing something with my buddies, or I've got ADHD that's not being managed, or I've got social anxiety, or there's something else going on there, right? So we've got to be very vigilant as parents and say, how's my child doing? Am I picking up that there's something going wrong, right? And if our kids do smoke vapes or they do start vaping, right, we got to work out what's going on here? What is the vaping bringing? A lot of people that start vaping early as kids, you'll be amazed at this, right? Many of them have ADHD underlying, right? Now, what happens when you have ADHD? Your dopamine levels are very low, right? And so you're looking for a stimulant if it's untreated, right? Now, nicotine is a stimulant. And often when people come into my practice and they're young people and they're vaping, and I say to them, I want to find out if you've got ADHD. They've either been diagnosed or they haven't been diagnosed, and it's there, right? And I'll say, please, I need you to see a psychiatrist. I want them to do an ADHD test to see if my suspicion is correct, right? Because I can't do the diagnosis, right? But a psychiatrist can. 90% of the time, I'm absolutely right. There's an ADHD underlying, and the person's looking for a stimulant, right?
Yeah.
So we have a lot of kids that are working around with a dopamine deficiency, and they're looking for stimulants, and they're self-medicating, and they're not getting the help that they need, right? So there are a number of drivers for vaping. Sociability,
amongst young people.
Yes, the coolness of it, the advertising, definitely the availability. But the availability is not a driver. There are many things that are available to us that we don't use, we just don't, right? Like healthy foods, it is available. People often say to me, it's more expensive to eat healthy foods. Actually not, right? You just grow an apple tree in your garden. You grow vegetables, right? You have your own chickens, right? Anything that has no hormones in it or no chemicals in it is far more healthy for you. It comes from the earth. It's natural, right? But people don't want to go through the effort of doing that, right? It's much more convenient to buy processed foods, right? So it's not necessarily about availability, because availability sometimes can be then we don't use it when it's better for us, or it can be difficult to be available and we still use it and we go searching for it, right? So to count that one out of the window, right? It's not just because they're available that people are using it. There's other reasons, right? I have 2 kids, for example, 2 boys who they have all their friends vape, but they don't, and they're not interested. They're simply not interested at all, right?
Nothing has triggered.
It doesn't bring anything into their lives, you know? And it's actually quite funny because 2 years ago when I was looking for these non-nicotine vapes, and I found them at a shop in Durban, there are not many of them, and I took them to the patient. I bought one for myself because I was like, hey, this is kind of cool. I'm not getting any nicotine, but I can vape, and I can do, because I was a smoker, right? Again, not a serious smoker, but I was a smoker. And I thought, like, maybe this will be like a good thing to have, right? And I took my non-nicotine vape and I introduced it to my son, right? And suddenly he was pulling this thing because he knew there was no nicotine in it, and he had never smoked in his life before. And he did it about 3 times, and then it was the novelty was over and he stopped, right? But that's because maybe there aren't the underlying driving factors that a lot of other young people do have, right? So he has the availability of vapes, and he's saying no, right? In fact, I was saying to him, give this a try. And he was like, no, Mom, I'm not interested. Like, I don't want to be doing this, So, we got to look at who our kids are and say, what is driving this? What's going on here? How can I help you through it? I've got another kid who's not even a kid. He's 19, right? And he's been vaping. He's been sort of hiding vaping from his parents. Then his parents found it under his pillow one night when he was asleep, He is highly ADHD, this kid. And I said to him, listen, what's going on with the vaping? He said, no, I do vape. And I said, well, your parents now have found out that you vape. So best you tell them about it and say, look, this is how much I'm using it. And he wasn't using it a lot. He was maybe using it like a few times, maybe 5 times a day, having a few puffs. It wasn't like anything to be alarmed about. But he came to my office last week and he said to me, I want to tell you something. I was like, what? He said, I stopped vaping. And I said, why? And he said, I just decided it wasn't really doing anything for me, so I just gave it up. And plus he said it was like quite expensive. It was like 100 Rand a thing, and I just don't have that availability,
kind of cash,
that cash. So I just stopped, right? So it was not a difficult thing for him to stop, but it served a purpose for a period of time. And I tell you what the difference was. He started having a much better relationship with his parents. They started understanding him better, and he was able to talk about the things that were really troubling him. The vape was just a tool for feeling a bit better, and once his mind was in a better space, the vape had no purpose anymore. So I'm not saying that that's always going to happen, but I'm going to say that there are multiple factors that underlie it. And yes, we want to get into the preventative space. And one way to do that is to understand our kids better, to understand their psychological space, their social space, their space in relation to schoolwork and other stresses that may be driving us. We live in a very, very stressful society in South Africa. People are constantly checking out.
Edge, yes.
There's edge. There's a lot of edge, right? People are worried about, am I going to get to this place safely? If I have sex, am I going to, contract some kind of STD? If I go to school? Am I going to finish and be able to get a job at the end of it? You know, am I going to be unemployed like the 75% of other people in a certain age bracket? We live in a seriously high-risk society. And so it's no surprise that South Africa is one of very few countries where cigarette smoking is on the increase and not on the decrease, right? Now, if we take that as a fact, and it is a fact, we've got to say, what is a less harmful way of dealing with this need to be having something in our hands to reduce the stress that we're feeling? It doesn't matter what the age of it is, right? We got to understand that this is the society we live in, right? And because we are patriotic, because we want to be in a society where people are healthier, where they feel more positive, we've got to get into the harm reduction space, not into the abstinence space.
Are there no risks at all with regards to possible addiction to vaping?
Of course they are, right?
Yeah.
But here's the thing. I want to tell you a funny story, right? We talk about addiction as if some things are addictive and other things aren't. But we've spoken about sugar already, right? And nobody speaks about sugar addiction, right? But there is a real sugar addiction in our society. Talk to people and ask them if they can stop. People have Coca-Cola. Ask them if they can stop having Coca-Cola. They'll tell you must be mad, right? And in fact, my secretary at work was talking about this yesterday. She was saying she and her son are trying to get off the 3 C's. What are the 3 C's?
Which is what?
Chips, chocolate, Coca-Cola.
Oh, boy.
She said she lasted 2 days. 2 days. There's no ways they could get off the 3 C's, right? Okay. Now, I'm a health coach, so I find the 3 C's pretty problematic, right? But a lot of people think it's absolutely fine, right?
Yeah.
Now, I'll tell you a little funny story about myself. I was living in Australia for 3 years, and I was pregnant with my second child when I was living in Australia. And I was taking, I've had a sleeping disorder most of my life, right? And I went to the doctor in Australia. I said, like, what do I do? Like, am I going to sleep if I don't have my one Dormanoct at night, right? My sleeping pill, my benzoid. And he was like, you can't have a benzoid if you're pregnant because you're going to harm the baby, right?
Yes.
And I was like, okay, what do I do? And he said, okay, is it the actual benzoid or is it you having a pill at night? Because I'd been taken for so long, it was a placebo, to be very honest, right?
And its effect were no longer strong.
No longer strong, right? And he said to me, I'll tell you what, take 2 Panado at night and see how you feel, right? So I started taking 2 Panado, which was doing nothing physiologically, right? But the fact that I was taking this thing every night was a ritual, right? My son, who I took 2 Panado for when I was pregnant, is now 20 years old. And here's the interesting thing. I still do it.
Wow.
I still do it.
And it helps you with sleep.
It helps me sleep. Or it's just in
The
my
mind.
brain.
No, it does.
Right?
It's in the
It's
mind.
in my brain, right?
Yeah.
Now, if you say to somebody, is Panado addictive? They'll say, chemically, no. But what people don't understand, it's not just the chemical. It's the ritual. It's the habit. It's the psyche, right? In my mind, I can't sleep without 2 Panados. Are the 2 Panados putting me to sleep? Absolutely not. They don't have those qualities,
No.
right? So when we talk about what's addictive and what's not, we got to be really careful. We've got to be more nuanced in understanding that. And this is another failure of medicine. Some things are addictive and other things are not. And when people come into my practice and they say, the doctor said this is more addictive, I'm like, hey, you are looking for something for a particular purpose. Anything that's put into your body right now is going to be addictive, if you want to use that word, because it serves a purpose, right? So, yes, it will be addictive if you have a need for that modality or for nicotine because you've got a dopamine deficiency and you're looking for a stimulant, or even if you don't and you're looking for a stimulant, right? So we've got to be a little bit more careful about how we use this term addiction. And this little story of the Panado is quite instructive actually around that.
Yeah. But
And the 3 C's.
I'm also curious about, because the way you explain it,
Yeah.
then vaping can be addictive.
Sure.
Contextually.
Absolutely.
Using your example.
Absolutely.
Because it becomes habit.
Absolutely.
It becomes a social trend
Yes.
that we are all moving
Yes.
towards. And now without it in my hand, without me pulling,
Yes.
I feel like something is missing.
Yes.
But you're saying, of course, you have to look at the underlying factors of why you're doing what you're doing.
Yes.
But that's probably why I want to push back a little bit and say, but if vaping becomes part of my ritual,
Yeah.
then it becomes part of my addiction.
Totally right. So I'll give you, but then again, you've got to tap into the individual. So I'm going to tell another story about myself, right? Because, before I came on air, we were talking about the importance of stories, right? When I was smoking 2 cigarettes at a day, my husband at the time, he bought me a vape. It was the early days of vaping. And I thought this was kind of cool because I could vape in my office, instead of going out to have a cigarette, right? And I found that what I was doing is that I was vaping much more than I was smoking because I could vape anywhere I wanted to, right? I was just vaping all day long.
Because cigarette needed a stop and to go.
Totally right, And I realized that actually what I was doing is I was putting more nicotine into my body by vaping than I was with cigarettes, right? Now, that was my personal experience. I decided to stop the vaping. But this was the good thing. It was easier to stop vaping than it was to stop smoking. So I had to go from smoking to vaping to complete cessation, right? It was an intermittent thing, right? But eventually I stopped both, right? Is it easier to stop smoking if you've gone into vaping? Yes. Does it mean that you will completely cease using anything? No, right? But for many people, it is a route to cessation completely. To some people, they transition from smoking to vaping. And there are many benefits. I've spoken about the carcinogenic, but the other one, of course, is the public health issue, right? When we smoke cigarettes, we're affecting everybody around us, right?
True.
And that is a major problem. And it's also an injustice to other human beings, right? So there are a whole number of reasons why vaping is preferred in terms of the public health space, but also in terms of the individual and their own health, because there are far less harms associated with it. But should we try to prevent it in the first place? Absolutely. Because as I've said, nicotine is not innocuous. It does have negative impacts, but far, far, far less harmful.
Transitional dual use. It's another word I came across.
Yes.
And that's people who are moving from one to another, but they're in the middle.
Yes.
Are there any harmful effects there? Surely there must be.
So, this is when substitution in any form, when you're beginning to substitute one for another, right? You will, even, let me go back to the opiate space, right? We use, largely in, when we do opiate substitution therapy, mostly we use a medication called methadone. There are others, but methadone is the one that is most commonly used, right? And most often when people go onto methadone, which is an opiate substitute, it stops the cravings. It does much the same as what an opiate does. It's just a lot safer without the extreme high, right? But most people, when they start, they are still using heroin at the same time, right? It's very unusual that people will just go onto an opiate substitute and not use other opiates at all. And after a while, people realize, actually, you know what? I don't want to be using the opiate, or I want to use it far less, right? So this dual using thing that you're talking about happens in all substitution spaces, not just in the smoking one, right? Ultimately, what people will say is which one makes me feel better and which one makes me feel worse, right? So let's say, for example, you're a gym person. You will know very, very clearly, if I have 5 cigarettes before I go to the gym, I'm going to not feel great when I go to the gym. But if I have a vape, a couple of times a day, I may actually feel fine, right? So your body will tell you, and we don't listen to our bodies, right? If we listen to our bodies, right, our bodies will tell us everything we need to know. Now, for somebody like me, let me go back to myself again. The vape was not terrible, but I did feel like I didn't need that stimulant all the time. And it was too much of a stimulant for me because I was only smoking twice a day, but I was vaping more often, right? And my body was saying, you're vaping too much, stop, right? Most of us are not intuitive about our use of substances, right? Whether it's saying, I'm going to have processed food. Most people, when they have processed foods, they feel sluggish, right? They don't feel like energetic.
Gotcha.
Who eats a McDonald's burger and wants to start running around the track?
No.
They want to go home and sit in front of the TV, right? Now, if you were to say what food is healthy for us and what isn't, it's a very simple rule. Food that gives you energy and makes you feel alive is good for you. Food that makes you sluggish is not good for you. And I'm not just talking about processed food. Some people have celiac problems. Other people are lactose intolerant. Others are, gluten intolerant, whatever. If you're intolerant to a particular food, it won't make you feel great. If we choose to ignore it, we're not going to feel great all the time, right? So the more we listen to our bodies, the more our bodies will tell us this is not serving us well, whether it's vaping or whether it's smoking, whatever it is, right? And we're not teaching people to be intuitive in terms of eating, in terms of smoking, in terms of drinking, in terms of anything, right? We've lost that ability to be intuitive. So being more mindful about what we put into our bodies, whatever that may be, is critical, right? Back to your point. There are many people that will be using both, right? And eventually they will choose one over the other. Most of the time, if people are smoking and vaping, eventually they will stop the cigarettes, most likely, right? And they will continue vaping. Whether they continue vaping into eternity or not is up to that person, right? So you've got someone like me who went on to vaping and decided this is not serving me at all, right?
Yeah.
There's too much. It's, the stimulant is too much, right? And I'm going to just stop. So now I don't smoke and I don't vape,
I'm curious about policy. And South African government is trying to have a voice in this conversation of vaping and other products included in these policies. But when I read and skim through some of these documents, I find a slight disconnect between their understanding of the real world and the product. I can understand the world is moving probably at a much faster rate than they can catch on. What are some of the most common misconceptions that you found in relation to policy?
Well, firstly, I think I'm going to say this again. South Africa is a highly moralistic society, right? It's either good or bad. There's no in between, right? And that comes from this very sort of, people are very bought on religion. And in this religion thing, there's no grey. It's black or white. It's either good or bad. It's good or evil, right? And we're stuck in that space. That's the first thing. The second one is that, there's a big hype around young people because we have a youth bulge in South Africa, right? And there is this thing about, okay, kids are vaping, this is bad, this is whatever, right? And there's a lack of realization about what it's doing in the harm reduction space because of the youth bulge, right? So the anxiety is a lot around kids, right? But the third thing is, South Africa is a curious country, right? We always want evidence that is specific to South Africa, right? So you've got evidence that tells you this has worked everywhere in the world. And South Africans will say, but I want you to prove it here. Right? It's a ridiculous situation. So now what's happening in the policy space is, the bill is in process. And there are a lot of hearings. I've been part of those hearings as well. Right? And they are, to be fair to government, they are trying to hear both sides of the debate. Those that are anti-vaping and those that see it as a harm reduction tool. And I'm hoping that what will happen in our bill will be that there will be something that talks to harm reduction and that does not conflate cigarette smoking with vaping, because they are very different in their impact, in their health consequences, and in their regulation as well, right? So we do need to regulate, and we need to talk about regulation. But if we see them as one and the same thing, we've missed the plot. And what is going to happen is vaping is going to go underground, right? And then we're not going to be able to play soccer in the light. And this is a very dangerous space that we're in. But to be fair to South Africa, the debate is robust. And I was listening to this again, and it's ongoing. It's not concluded yet. So we haven't concluded yet our legislation. I'm not sure where it's going, but from what it feels like and from when I presented, which was about 2 months ago, I could feel that within Parliament there were people on both sides of the debate, but it's always the people that are anti that speak the loudest, And so you have these kinds of ridiculous arguments, that actually are just very commonsensical and they're not evidence-based, right? The last talk that I heard, which was this week that was given, there was so much evidence around the less harmful impact of vapes that I'll be very surprised if anyone comes out of that hearing without saying, look, we really, really need to look more critically at what we're trying to propose here, which is making, vaping as problematic as smoking. So I think hopefully we're going to come out with something more nuanced, which is more in line with, say, places like Sweden, England, now, the UK, which are all now saying, look, there's a public health space for vaping, right? And look at those countries rather than...
Give me an example of some of their policies.
Their policies would be around saying vaping is a form of harm reduction. So it's bringing harm reduction into the policy and talking about it, right? Yeah. So saying that, we can get into having less harmful impacts with, for example, vapes or with non-combustible products, right? And we need to introduce those, because they are less harmful, but also because they are a route towards a smoke-free society. And this is where the legislation is going. But there is very strong regulation around people under the age of 18 and the access to that, right? So it's very strongly regulated. Does it mean that people under the age of 18 can't get it? No, because you can send your older brother or your uncle or your father or somebody else to get it, right? But at the end of the day, that's the case for all substances. We also don't sell alcohol to people under the age of 18, but people go into their families and they're like, hey, you know what? I'm going to let my kid, start drinking when they're 14, because that's what people do in France. They start introducing their kids really young, and maybe if you do it in a controlled way, it won't become a problem. Well, we don't know if that's true or not, right? But we do know that in South Africa we have a big alcohol problem, and that it's not just because people start when they're 18, when it's legally available, right? So we can legislate, we can regulate, we can educate, we can talk about the harms that I've already spoken about. I've been very clear. I haven't said to you vaping is innocuous. I've said that it is. It's the same with cannabis, right? Cannabis, many people say that cannabis is not harmful at all. That is not true. I'm a cannabis user as well. I'll be straight up about it, right? And I use it for a particular purpose. It's also become my go-to for sleeping, right? Works really well. But there have been times when I've used it and I've gone on a trip and it hasn't been great, and I've been like, oh my God, am I going to come off this trip, right? So is cannabis always innocuous? If you've got a serious underlying psychiatric issue, it can make it worse, right? And is it okay for people under the age of 18 to use cannabis? No, it's not, because it can demotivate you, right? And it can make you feel like, okay, I've got nothing else to look forward to in my life, right? And so there are problems, right? So people who say, oh, cannabis is fine, doesn't really matter. It's also not true, right? Everything has a consequence. But I'm going to go back to this as well. I'm going to say so does processed food, and so does sugar, and so does alcohol, and so does not wearing a seatbelt, right? So we've got to get into the language of talking about how do we reduce harms.
Policy also touches on access. The very point you're raising now.
Yeah.
How easily accessible
totally
are
right.
some of these products.
Yeah.
Policy also want to touch on advertising, shelf advertising at stores and so forth.
Yeah.
What do you say to that before I carry on with my question?
So I do think that there will need to be something around, as we move towards hopefully a space where we see vaping as less harmful, where we don't say that it's not harmful at all, right? And that, that when it's advertised, that we say, these are the harms associated with vaping. And we note
Which
what
is
those
what
are.
happens with cigarettes.
Exactly
but
right.
But it doesn't happen with alcohol.
No, it doesn't happen with alcohol, and it doesn't happen with sugar. I'm going to keep on going back to sugar. And I'm going to go back to sugar.
And I know that.
No,
and I agree with you 100% on
We have
sugar.
an epidemic, and that's an obesity epidemic.
True.
And together with that is diabetes. And let me tell you,
100%.
if somebody was to say to me, would you rather have HIV or diabetes? I'd say HIV any day, right? Because it's controllable, right? When you get diabetes, it's not, right? But we are not talking about the harms of sugar. And, sorry, I banged the table. And we need to be talking about it, right? It's really, really important. So in this space, yes, we do need to be saying, why is it not ideal to be vaping? If we can stop vaping, we stop vaping. We don't promote it, right? But there is a space for promoting vaping. And that is when we're moving out of tobacco smoking. So let's say you are a pulmonologist and you've got a patient who is smoking 20 cigarettes a day, and you're going to say to that person, stop smoking. They're going to walk out of your office, they're going to have a cigarette.
Of course.
Right?
Yeah.
But if you say to them, you know what? I've got an alternative. I've got a substitute, which is less harmful. Let's talk about it. Maybe use the nicotine pouch, or maybe get into a vape, or maybe do something else, which is going to reduce the harms of your tobacco smoking, which is carcinogenic, right? Yeah. Doctors also will have an answer, right? And so there are a lot of medical people that are now saying, how do we use this in a harm reduction space, right? We had a closed round table a couple of months ago where there were a number of specialists talking about this. Initially, they came into the room and they were all, I think, more towards anti-vaping. And as we got speaking about vaping more and about how it's a less harmful substance, they were like, we actually need to have protocols that allow us to talk about this as clinicians, because as clinicians, we struggle with the smoking cessation. Most of our patients don't want to hear it, and if we give them an alternative, maybe we've got a win-win here, right? So there are a lot of complicated factors here. If you're an oncologist, you much rather your patient be vaping than using tobacco-based cigarettes, right? So, this is a much broader debate. It goes into medicine, it goes into public health, it goes into parenting, it goes into disability rights, into mental health rights. It goes into every aspect of society, But you're absolutely right. We've got to have signs up there saying this is not unharmful and this should not be available to people under the age of 18. It should not be available to people that are not aware. We don't have
any signs at all right now.
We don't have signs at the moment. Yeah. Although I think now some of the better companies are putting things on there, but we do need to be speaking. And of course, there are so many companies making vapes at the moment. We need to say which are the companies we trust and which are the ones that we're going to promote and which ones can we engage with and which ones are prepared to acknowledge that there are harms, And the difficulty in this space is industry, right? Because the same people that are making cigarettes are now making vapes, And that's
they don't want to lose this rand. They want to get both sides of it.
Correct.
Makes sense.
But again, this is exactly where we need to be speaking to industry and saying, how committed are you really to harm reduction? Is this really you being committed to harm reduction, or is this just a profit-making enterprise, right? And so we engage with companies like Philip Morris, and we say to them, okay, you've got a lot of vapes out there. Are you doing this because you eventually want to stop producing cigarettes, or are you doing it because you want both markets, right? And to be fair to Philip Morris in this respect, they are engaging in the harm reduction space, right? The sincerity of it, I can't make a claim for that. I'm not part of the industry, right? But at least they're engaging, and at least they're open to the conversation. And we need to be saying we want Philip Morris and other cigarette producers to be talking to governments, to be talking to people in the public health space, to be saying, okay, when we do produce these vapes, who are they available to? If we're saying that they are less harmful, how do we make them more affordable? Because if we're saying they're less harmful, but they're less affordable than cigarettes, of course people are going to buy the 2 rand loose on the street, because why would you not if you're not going to be able to afford a vape, right? So there are a whole lot of issues around regulation and affordability that come into this conversation.
Another interesting point for me is that every time our Minister of Finance speaks of all sorts of taxes, there's a sin tax that we all know, which normally affects alcohol and cigarettes. Vaping is not part of that. Should it be part of that?
My answer to that is what shouldn't be part of it, And there is now a conversation about sugar and the sin taxing as well, and we've got to open it up. We've got to say, there's gambling, there's alcohol, there's tobacco, there's illicit drugs and licit drugs, there's sugar. We've got 5 very harmful substances that are in the room. They should all be under the same scrutiny. In fact, we need to say these are the harmful substances. How are we dealing with them all? And how are we looking at less harmful substitutes for each of these substances that we're talking about?
It's an interesting one for me because obviously we have lobbyists everywhere who will fight for their product not to ever be included in that very list.
Absolutely.
And those are the challenges that you're likely to face. It ends up becoming a long political debate that never gets a solution. And maybe we can agree in this table that some of these issues are quite urgent. They need to be addressed immediately.
Professor Yanni Hugo, who is a professor emeritus at the University of Pretoria, and has been doing harm reduction mostly in the drug space for many, many years. Very fascinating human being. And, having him part of that round table a couple of months ago, and Yanni was saying he wants to set up like a scientific institute to look at these, big 5 substances or harms in
what
society.
Are the big 5?
The alcohol, tobacco, drugs, sugar, gambling, and say, okay, how do we get into a less harmful space with the big 5, and, present the evidence that's before us, right? But have the debates, have the discussions, because we do need the science, and we also need the advocates on either side to have the science behind them and not to be doing it purely on moralistic, commonsensical perspectives. Right?
Is that where we are now?
I think that no, I don't think we're only there now, but I think we are only beginning to look at the evidence now. But there is a pushback with everything. Like we can see now, we came from a very progressive country in 1994, when all our laws were about saying, how do we become progressive? Whether it was around, sexuality rights, whether it was around for example, religious freedom, whether it was around freedom of speech, whether it was around the death penalty. Let's use the death penalty as a good one, right? So one of the most progressive laws that we made was the abolition of the death penalty, right? Because that is a fundamental denial of human rights, right? And Albie Sachs was very, very amazing in the work that he did around the abolition of the death penalty. But as we've become a so-called more mature democracy, what's happened? People calling for the death penalty to come back. Right.
Because of their lived experience.
Partly, yes.
Makes it feel like, well, an eye for an eye.
Totally right. Yeah. But it's not just the lived experience. That's part of it, right? It's also about this extreme religious fundamentalism that we have in South Africa, right? And we are really, really struggling with what is evidence and what is moralistic, and they are not the same thing. And we really need to be saying, okay, what in this debate is just about morals and what is it about the evidence? Now, the question about evidence is a complicated one, right? Because scientists can prove whatever they want, right? So we need to be very clear on how do we understand science, what do we understand as good evidence, and what do we understand as bad evidence. And when we do that, we need to say, okay, what are the journals in which people publish? What are the peer review rules that they've been through, and what do we trust, And there are certain rules for scientists about what is good evidence and what is bad evidence. And unfortunately, people that are not scientists or have not been in the science space, they're not aware of these debates, and where this comes in. And so it is very important to have experts who are really good scientists who are talking about this, but we have to listen. And it is going to be a debate, because there is evidence, that there are health issues with vaping. And that's why I'm not one of those people that say it's harmless. I'll never say that. And I'm saying it again with the cannabis thing. There are people that say cannabis is a plant. It can't do any harms. And I'm saying, yes, it can. I'm a user, but I know that there are harms associated with cannabis. If you have psychiatric issues that, it can help, but it can also harm. And if you're under the age of 18, and I've spoken about the lack of motivation, right? And there is a science to that. But there are scientists who believe that cannabis in any form is terrible. And that is bad science, because it's not true. It's simply not true, right? So I think we need to be saying to Parliament, do you understand science? And what science do you follow? And who are the scientists that you respect? And it's the same with everything that we do in life, right? People will say to me, they come into my practice and they say, there are 55 different diets on at the moment, or ways of eating, right? Which one do I follow? And it's a simple answer. Decide who you trust. Yes. Read up what they say. Look at what they're saying. Do they make sense to you? How much science is behind what they're promoting? And then you make a decision. I'm not here to tell you this person is right or wrong. And at the end of the day, for some people, they may go into keto and it will work brilliantly. But for other people, it won't, So listen to your body. But there are certain facts that we know that are indisputable. Yeah. We know that there are certain oils that are really bad for us. We know that processed food is bad for us. We know that sugar is bad for us. These are things that are not disputable anymore because there is so much science behind it, right? But the rest, go ahead and choose what nutrition plan works for you. Now, this is it. We need to say who are the scientists that we follow, but we need to know why. If you say to me, I'm going to follow somebody from a university that I've never heard of in my life, or I'm going to listen from somebody from Oxford or Yale or one of those universities.
Or I listen to an influencer on YouTube.
Or an influencer on YouTube, exactly, yes. Right? So we've got to be a little bit smarter. There's too much information around, in a way, right? But we've got to use it wisely. We've got to use it smartly. And we've got to say, who do we believe and who do we not believe, right? It's a very, very difficult space to be in because there is so much information.
It is. When in preparation for this, I realized how complex this issue is.
Yeah.
Because there's a recreational side to vaping.
Sure.
That can be ignored.
Sure.
The people who do it because it's fun.
Yes.
Remember earlier we were talking about possible underlying issues, possible, your own mental issues that you're dealing with. But also there are people who are doing it because it's just fun.
Yes.
And that's a factor that you cannot be ignored at all.
Totally right.
Yes.
And, people often ask me why do you use drugs? And I say to them, it's not that difficult to understand, right? The first reason is because it feels nice, and everybody wants to feel good, right? And that's why people play around with substances, And, that's why people phone me and they'll say, oh my God, my son is a drug addict. And I'll say to them, okay, what's happening with your son? And they'll say, he uses cocaine like once a month. And I'll say, that's not a drug addict.
Not a drug addict.
It's
the
really
recreational use.
Exactly. It's recreational use. It's a non-issue. The more you make it a problem, the more it will become a problem. Let it be, right? Let it be. Just let it be, right?
But you can't fault a parent who's consent.
You can't fault it, but you can say the more you make it an issue, the more it's going to become an issue.
Yeah.
You know, the more you want it to go underground, the more it's going to become used underground. The more it's underground, the more you're playing soccer in the dark. The more you're playing soccer in the dark, the less your kid's going to speak to you. And if there's a reason for using the cocaine, you're never going to know about it. You know, and I have these discussions on a day-to-day basis, right? So we need to say sometimes recreational things are okay. You know, but we also got to say when it's no longer recreational. And when it's no longer recreational, it's when it becomes your go-to, when it becomes your way of coping with life. Then you've got a serious problem.
It's the first and last option.
Absolutely. It becomes salient, right? And when it's salient, then you've got a problem that you're dealing with. And it doesn't matter what it is. It doesn't matter whether it's comfort eating. It doesn't matter whether it's cigarette smoking, whether it's vaping, whether it's cannabis, whether it's gambling, because gambling is also an escapism, right? When it becomes the most important thing in your life, you've got a big problem, right? You've got a big problem. If I go to the casino, I don't, but if I was to go to the casino twice a year, right, and say I'm going to blow 1,000 rand.
We can't be concerned.
It's neither here nor there, right?
Yes.
But if I was taking my salary on a weekly basis and I was using it at the casino, I got a big problem.
Or taking loans to go to the casino.
Correct, right?
Yeah.
So we've got to understand the continuum, you know, and if we absolutist, if it's like, okay, this is good and this is bad, we're going to get nowhere because we're just going to be playing soccer in the dark.
I want to give you a pen and make you the policy writer.
Oh, thank you.
For this challenge we're facing in the world or in the country of vaping. What policy, in a few words, would you write? What would be probably one and 2 points that should be in the policy?
Well, I think, you know, if we are to look at the Tobacco Act, which includes the vaping at the moment, firstly, I would say we really do need to get as much as possible towards a smoke-free society. That's a given, right? Okay. The second one is to say, how do we tax cigarettes so that they do become really difficult to access? Because we know there's nothing positive about cigarette smoking. I can't find anything. Oh, there's one positive. It does help with IBS, just by the way.
What is IBS?
Irritable bowel syndrome. It can relieve that, right? Okay. That's maybe the only positive thing. But you
sure,
can
there are other options.
Yeah, well, yes, there are. But it does effectively sort that out. But then you're saying, okay, I'm going to, it's one harm getting out of another. Yeah. And then we've got to say, you know, in the vaping space, we've got to say, what is in what way can we use vaping as a form of harm reduction? You know, we got to bring harm reduction into the act, and we've got to speak about it in relation to getting to smoking cessation, and in relation to, for example, chronic smokers, and mostly chronic smokers with chronic illness. How do we reduce the harms in relation to that? In relation to the youth situation, we do need to say we don't want kids to start vaping. So we've got to get into a preventative space. But if they're already vaping, how do we regulate? And those are the ways in which I think we should be dealing with this particular act.
What are the current rules of the game with regards to vaping in particular?
At the moment, it's a little bit of an open space because it's not properly regulated and because, you know, the act is still in process. So there's a lot of talk, but it's not properly regulated at the moment. And we're in that space where it's been debated. You know, hopefully in the next couple of months, you know, it will be finalized. But, you know, true to South Africa, and for those of us that are patriots, we've opened the debate wide. We have a lot of people coming in and giving different forms of evidence, and there's robust debate, much more robust than in other countries, right? And people saying a lot of crazy stuff, you know, and people saying a lot of reasonable stuff, you know. And we have, you know, people that are very conservative in our government, and we have people that are more progressive, and so the continuum is very large, right? And we allow for those conversations, and that is the positive thing about South Africa. And I do believe, because we're South Africa, and because ultimately we do want to be progressive in our legislation, that I'm hoping that we will follow the more progressive countries in what we legislate and not become moralistic.
I want to bring in something as we conclude.
Yeah.
It's not vaping, but from someone who doesn't do any of whether smoking or vaping or any of those things.
Yeah.
They kind of look the same from a distance.
Yeah.
It's this other contraption that people do. It has water in it, and it says grrr, that thing.
The Hubley.
It clearly, from a distance, someone who doesn't know, who's a parent, who's saying, what are are these kids doing?
Yeah.
It kind of feels and looks like the same.
Yeah.
What is the difference from a perspective of someone who vapes and versus someone who uses a Hubley?
Not much, because there again, the Hubley is probably less harmful because you're not directly burning, the paper and having it. But the heating mechanism
there's
is,
a chuck thing.
If I was to say between vaping and the Hubley, I'd probably still go for the vape, because the heat is so direct, But is it less harmful than cigarettes? I think it probably is. I haven't got a lot, but remember, a lot of the stuff that people are putting into the Hubleys is tobacco.
That's
right?
it, yeah.
And it's very flavored.
The flavorants and all of that.
So
yeah.
I think that those are more harmful than the vapes are, if you want my opinion. And I haven't done any research around the Hubleys, but because of I know what the substance that is used, and it is largely flavored tobacco, I would say it's probably not amazing. But most people that do Hubleys are not doing it every day. It's a very social thing.
Yeah.
And again, we've got to make allowances for that in the same way that we make allowances for alcohol and for other stuff as well, is to say, if you're not doing it all the time and you're just doing it as a social thing, and you're going to, let's say, a restaurant which has a Middle Eastern feel, and you're doing that once a month, it's neither here nor there. You're not going to die from it, right? But if you're doing it at home every day, there probably are harms associated with that as well.
I've seen, I DJ quite a bit, and you see people who would do it the whole night.
Yeah.
From the minute they sit, they're holding a drink and they have this thing.
Yeah. Yeah.
And they just blowing.
Yeah.
Look, it's definitely all day, all night long.
Totally right. It's definitely less harmful than a cigarette, right?
Yeah.
Because remember, you don't have that direct combusting happening, right? And I don't want to speak too much about this because I've not actually explored it, so I don't want to get onto it. But we do know what's in the Hubley thing, and maybe. I don't know. Maybe there are people that are putting in products that are less harmful. I don't know about that, So I don't want to really get into an area that I haven't really done any research into.
I found this very interesting, this conversation, and I personally wish for a society that uses nothing. But then again, that's not possible. A society that doesn't use a lot of sugar, society that doesn't gamble. I'm already sounding like a dictator. and that's probably a far more reasonable society. However, as we agreed in this conversation, that it'll happen whether you like it or not.
Exactly.
It'll happen behind closed doors.
Yeah.
It'll happen secretly, and it'll almost be packaged incorrectly and end up becoming more harmful.
Yeah.
How do you conclude this conversation?
I conclude the conversation by saying that, it's always a very difficult thing to tell people what they should and shouldn't put into their bodies, that we are individuals with brains and we have reasons for doing what we do. And, if we're really concerned about another human being, we need to understand what is the motive behind it, And instead of saying stop, we've got to meet people where they're at. We've got to go at their pace. We've got to find a substitute if they need it, and stop just saying to people, seize and abstain and punish people, because most people that are using substances are already highly traumatized. And if we do that, we're just adding to the trauma. So I'm saying we've got to open up. We've got to open conversations. We've got to find out what the underlying issue is. And maybe there's not an underlying issue. Maybe it is just fun. Maybe it is just enjoyment. And that actually, having fun and being happy is part of being healthy, right? As long as it's not entirely harmful to us. So if somebody goes and they use MDMA once a month and it makes them feel like they can just be totally out of their skulls and have an amazing time, you go.
Yeah.
You go, right?
Just don't stay there too long.
But I think, we are so quick to judge, but we so hate being judged ourselves, right?
That is true.
Yeah. And I think we need to really, before we judge people, say, what am I doing that is probably harming myself or harming other people? And get a reality check on that, because we're all doing harmful stuff in our own lives, And then have the conversation, which is to say, how can we slowly move you into a space that is less harmful to yourself and to other people? That's sort of where I would say we need to be thinking, rather than saying this is good or this is bad.
Thank you so much, Prof. I truly enjoyed this.
Good.
I thought it was rather insightful, considering that I'll be publishing this around the same time
Yeah.
as a porn addiction podcast that I recorded.
Amazing.
And you'll be surprised to realize that the concepts are pretty similar.
That's great.
We're talking about the underlying issues.
Yep.
Why is this happening?
Yep.
Can we talk about
Yep.
why are the issues happening? So
Yep.
thank you so much. This
No
has
problem.
been very insightful for me.
I'm very glad.
Yeah.
You were a great interviewer, so
Thank
it
you.
made it much easier.
Thank you
Yeah.
very much.
King David Studio Podcast.